All right.
All right, so should I go ahead and get started?
Yeah, you can go
Okay,
ahead.
I'm just gonna share my screen so I can show my slides and then start my slideshow here. And just feel free if anybody has a question I'm not so great about keeping an eye on the chat box as I'm speaking, I will freely admit that, but you can either ask a question or we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. So I am going to a little outline of what I'm going to talk about. And some of this, since we've been living with COVID now for what seems like a really long time, but it is going on 2 years. Some of this might be a little bit of review for you, but I did want to talk just a little bit about some of the definitions and symptoms and transmission. Then I'm going to show you a little bit about where we are in the pandemic in terms of the trends of cases. And then talk about the impact of COVID on children, not just in terms of COVID infection, but just thinking a little bit about the other ways that this pandemic has impacted children. And I think, with the recent authorization of vaccines for our children down to 5 to 11, I think I wanted to spend some time on that. And so I'll show you a little what I think is a very nice little cartoon from the American Academy of Pediatrics that I think nicely explains how the mRNA vaccines work, give you a little bit more information about what we know about the vaccines in children, or the COVID vaccines in children. And then as Brittany talked about, just mention a few things about other childhood vaccines, because I think we've sort of put those kind of forgotten about those a little bit in the midst of everything else that's been going on. So I just like to clarify a few things because I think we hear all of these terms in the news and like what means what. So I find it useful to kind of review this and put it into perspective. So when we say coronavirus, there's actually lots of different types of coronaviruses. There's probably about 7 that we know of. And some of them are very, they're no big deal. Like many of our common colds that we get every year are from certain types of coronaviruses. But there are 3 types of coronaviruses that cause very severe disease. One of them is called SARS-CoV-1, which we learned about, maybe 15 years ago. And that stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome caused by coronavirus 1. Then there's a MERS, which arose a few years ago. And now we have SARS-CoV-2. So SARS-CoV-2 stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. And the reason it's named that is because it looks very similar to that first coronavirus I mentioned. So this is the virus that's causing all of the problems we've been living with lately during this pandemic. And then when we say COVID-19, that's actually the illness that this virus causes. So SARS-CoV-2 is the virus that's responsible for the pandemic, but all the symptoms that it causes and the illness that it causes, that's what COVID-19 means. So when we say COVID-19, we're talking about the illness. When we say SARS-CoV-2, we're talking about the virus. So I think they get used a little bit interchangeably, but I just wanted to make that distinction for you. By this, you probably all know that the symptoms, and fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath, severe fatigue, body aches, headaches, sore throat, cough, runny nose, nausea, vomiting. If you think about it, those symptoms are very what we call non-specific, meaning there's lots and lots of different things that look like this. We've all probably had most, if not all of these symptoms at some point in our life. And then the one that is rather unique to SARS-CoV-2 is the loss of taste or smell. But other than that, patient that comes into my office with fever and cough and fatigue, that could be anything. So we really have to be thinking about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 and many of the patients that we see in the clinic. The other thing that's important to know about COVID-19 is that it can be asymptomatic. That means that you can have the infection and have absolutely no symptoms from it. And that's been one of the tricky things about this whole pandemic is that I think I have this on the next slide. This is basically what I just said. To be asymptomatic means you're infected with the virus and you have no symptoms, but the problem is that you can still infect other people. And that's been one of the major difficulties with this pandemic is that you can have you can be infected with the virus, not even know it, be walking around and spreading it. And that's why a lot of the mitigation measures that we've been talking about for so long, including masks and social distancing and things like that, are so important. A couple of other terms to review and just sort of general things to think about this virus is that you can be exposed to the virus and be infected with the virus, and it can take anywhere from 2 to 14 days after your exposure to develop your symptoms. So that's where the quarantine comes from, right? When we are exposed to someone who we know has SARS-CoV-2, we are supposed to quarantine for 14 days. Now there are some caveats there, and it's changed a little bit over time with the pandemic, but that's still the general principle. I already talked about in the middle that if you're infected, you can spread the virus before you could actually never have symptoms, or you could develop symptoms and be spreading the virus before you have your symptoms. So that's sort of the same principle as asymptomatic spread. And then once you're infected, you can spread the virus and infect other people for 10 days. And that's why the period of isolation that we have to be in if we have the virus is for 10 days. So those are just important things to think about. And that I just kind of wanted to explain to you where those numbers for quarantine and isolation come from. There's really science behind it. Now I'm going to be showing you a lot of graphs tonight. I don't want to get into too much detail, but I really do think pictures can explain things a lot better than me. So I wanted to show you a few things. This graph is a graph of the number of cases of COVID in the United States from the beginning of the pandemic. So if you look way back here, this is February of 2020, and the higher the line, the more cases there are. And this particular graph is for the whole United States. I'm going to show you Arkansas next. So if you go back to last February when all of this was just starting, we had very few cases, then they went up, kind of leveled off over the summer, went up again, dipped back down. This is this time last year when we had our huge peaks last winter. And then everything got better. We were doing so well over the summer, thinking we were getting at the end of this pandemic, right? And then here's the Delta virus. And so this is our second peak. Well, actually, people are calling this the fourth peak. If you think 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the Delta virus. Things are starting to get a little better and now going back up again. And the thing that's important, obviously the height of the peak tells you something about the number of cases. And if you look at these lines, this is 100,000 cases, 2,000 cases, and each point on this line is a day. So these are cases in a day that have been diagnosed in the United States. But if you look at sort of the valleys of this graph, here's one valley, this valley here. Now we sort of seem to be getting better, but look how much higher this sort of flattening off is compared to where we were over the summer. Things we're getting better, but they weren't getting down to the level of where they were before. And now here we are going up again. So it's sort of starting from a higher baseline than where we were. And that's concerning as we head into the winter. In general, winter is a time where we see more viruses, where things spread more because we're closer together, we're more inside. And now, just within the last week, we have this new Omicron variant that we're dealing with, and we really don't know what's going to happen with that. So this is kind of where we are right now, still in the United States, close to 100,000 cases a day, which is quite a bit. Hold on, I need to get rid of my picture on my end was blocking things. And then just to give you a little bit more of the numbers over here. So far in the United States, we've had over 48 million cases of COVID and over 777,000 deaths. Now this graph is just Arkansas. And what you can see is the shape is exactly the same as the previous graph that I showed you. It's just the numbers are much lower. So here we have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. So the same thing, we had our peak, things were getting so much better. And then we had the Delta variant. And now again, things are getting better, but going back up again. And again, this sort of valley is not as low as it was before. This in Arkansas, we've had over 500,000 cases and over 8,000, close to 9,000 deaths from COVID. These graphs that I showed you previously were all cases, all ages, all cases. But it's important to remember that children are infected by COVID-19 too. And this is actually an old slide. I'm going to show you some new numbers. These numbers are actually much, much higher now. But one thing that I think happened that was really sort of did a disservice to those of us who work with children and worry about children all the time is that in the beginning of the pandemic, it was mostly elderly who were doing very poorly. And that was absolutely true. But I think we got this false sense of security for our children, thinking, oh, they're going to be fine. COVID's not going to be a problem for kids. And that's really not the case. But I think that idea sort of got stuck in our head. And now, especially with the Delta variant, we're really seeing the evidence that that's not true. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that. This is the cases in children, just in children. So you can see, if you remember those previous graphs, it follows the exact same graph, same shape. So we went up, we got better. Now we went up again with the Delta variant, came down a little bit, and now we're going back up. And what we've seen, since the beginning of the pandemic, the percentage of cases that we're seeing in children is going up and up and up and up. So initially it was like 1 or 2% of all cases were in children. Now we're up to close to 20% of cases being in children. And if you look at the week that ended November 18th, there were more than 140,000 cases just in children. And that was a real increase from what we had been seeing before. So far, since the beginning of the pandemic, there have been 6.7 million cases in children. Again, close to 17% of the cases so far overall are in children. But if you look at like the more recent weeks, that percentage is actually a bit higher. We've had over 25,000 children hospitalized from COVID, and we've had 636 children who have died from COVID, which is really tragic if you think about it, because children should not be getting sick from an infectious disease and dying. And so what we know now is that COVID-19 is 2.5 times more deadly than the flu for children, than influenza. And it was one of the top 10 causes of death in children in 2020. Specifically in Arkansas, we have had over 102,000 cases in children. 937 children have been hospitalized, and we've had, unfortunately, 3 deaths in children in Arkansas from COVID. I did want to quickly mention, you might have heard about this, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, or MIS-C. So this is a interesting phenomenon that it can happen in adults rarely, but it was definitely first seen in children and is predominantly seen in children. And it's something that happens a few weeks after the COVID infection, and it can cause symptoms such as fever, abdominal pain, rash, diarrhea, and can cause really severe problems with the heart and kidneys, and actually lead to what we call shock. And children can get very, very sick from this. And the thing is that it can happen after someone's had a very severe COVID infection. It can happen after someone's had a mild COVID infection. It can even happen after someone's had an asymptomatic COVID infection. And so far in the United States, we've seen 5,500 cases and 48 deaths, unfortunately, from MIS-C in children. And then I think it's important to think about how this pandemic has affected our children in other ways. Outside of the immediate COVID-19 symptoms, outside of MIS-C, you might have heard of long hauler syndrome or long COVID, where people have symptoms for weeks and months, especially things like fatigue, severe fatigue, kind of mental haziness, headaches, myalgias or muscle aches. And we're actually seeing that in children. We still don't have great numbers in terms of how often it happens in children. Some studies are showing about 10 to 15% of children who are infected develop long COVID. But then I think there are so many other ways. If you think about the impact on our children's education from this pandemic, I think the long-term effects of that are going to be very significant. So many children were out of school for such a long time. I think many of us can attest to the fact that even when our children were on, virtual or Zoom or whatever was being used, it certainly was not the same as them being in school from an educational standpoint. And I think especially children who, if you think about trying to learn to read for the first time in this type of education, children who have special educational needs and weren't able to receive the services that they need, I think trying to catch up from that and just the long-term impact on that child's education moving forward is going to be profound. I think also socialization, you probably saw some of this, especially if you have slightly older children, not getting that socialization in school, not being able to spend time with their friends, not being able to participate in sports. That definitely impacted our children. And then just the mental health impact, I think, has been definitely significant. We know in children, we've seen increases in anxiety and depression to the extent that recently the American Academy of Pediatrics and other organizations declared that there's a mental health crisis in children right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with the pandemic. So I think it's important to think about the whole picture and how all of these factors are impacting our kids. Just a little review, sort of shifting gears a little bit. This, I think you've probably heard more than you want to hear about all the things we need to do to keep ourselves safe and healthy during this time. But I think it's worth revisiting because I think, especially this summer, I think we all relaxed a little bit and we needed to, right? Things were getting better. We had been living with all these restrictions for so long. But now with the cases going up again, and with this new variant that we still really don't know what to expect, I think it's important to remind ourselves how important these factors are, especially for many of you who have children who are too young to be vaccinated. These are the main things that protect them, right? So wearing your face mask, socially distancing, good hand hygiene, and then staying home when you're sick, which most of us are not very good about doing, right? We kind of try to push through and go to work or send our kids to school, but it's really important right now to try our best not to do that. And then, of course, now, thankfully, we have our vaccinations, and that's a very powerful way to protect ourselves and others from COVID. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. You probably know now that we have 3 vaccines in the United States that are authorized. We have the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which are the mRNA vaccines. And then we have the Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine, which is a little bit different. It uses a different technology called a viral vector. Johnson & Johnson is for 18 and over, Moderna is for 18 and over, and Pfizer now we have down to 5 years and over. Because of Pfizer is the only one that we really have for our children, I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about that. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how the mRNA vaccines work, and then show you some data about what we know about this vaccine in children. So this is this website, if you're not familiar with it, healthychildren.org, you may be familiar with it. It's sort of the parent education website from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's a great website. I get a lot of information there that I share with parents, and it has everything from like prenatal information to every illness you could think of in children all the way through adolescence. It's a really great resource, and they do have a lot of COVID information. So if you still have questions or are looking for information, I would encourage you to check this website. That's where I got this cartoon from that I'm going to show right now.
They partner with your child's immune system, teaching it how to stay strong and healthy when exposed to viruses and other threats. Vaccination is one of the most effective ways to protect your child from preventable diseases and to help them thrive. While some people are just hearing about them now, vaccines made with messenger ribonucleic acid, or mRNA, have been studied for decades. Unlike many childhood vaccines that contain tiny parts of a virus or bacteria to train the immune system, mRNA COVID-19 vaccines don't contain any parts of the coronavirus. Instead, they teach the body to recognize the virus in the future. The mRNA in the vaccine teaches your child's immune system to do what it would normally do, but faster and better. As soon as the vaccine is injected into your child's upper arm, it goes to work. You've probably seen pictures of the coronavirus, a ball covered in spikes. Vaccines using mRNA teach your child's body to make spikes out of proteins. These proteins look like spikes on the virus that causes COVID-19, but aren't actually the virus. Your child's immune system recognizes that the spikes shouldn't be there, so it produces antibodies that eliminate those spike proteins. The antibodies then remember what to do if your child is exposed to the virus in the future. This all happens very quickly. After the mRNA in the vaccine instructs your child's body how to make the spike protein, it's broken down in a matter of hours. A second vaccine dose about 3 to 4 weeks later reinforces the earlier instructions so that the immune system prepares itself even better. 2 weeks after your child gets the second dose, they are considered fully vaccinated. Most vaccinations, including a COVID-19 vaccination, can sting. Some people have a sore arm afterward. Just like adults, some children may experience fever, chills, headache, or nausea. Those side effects go away quickly and are a sign that the immune system is learning how to protect the body against the virus, similar to how your muscles feel sore after a workout. Serious side effects from vaccination are very rare. Of children who do experience side effects, most feel back to normal in a few days. If your child is fully vaccinated, they are far less likely to get infected. Or on the rare chance that they get COVID-19, they're far less likely to become seriously ill or die. COVID-19 vaccination gives peace of mind because it greatly decreases the risk of COVID-19 infection. Like a good coach, the vaccine does its job, and your child will be in good shape, ready to thrive.
So I think that does a great job of explaining how the mRNA vaccines work, but we certainly can talk more about that if you have questions. So then the next question is, okay, that's how they work, but are they effective? Do they actually work in keeping us safe? And again, I have a lot of fancy graphs here that I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think they're striking. This one on the left is talking about COVID-19 cases. And the only thing I want you to look at is the difference between these lines down here at the bottom and these lines up here at the top. The bottom lines, the solid lines, are fully vaccinated people, and the dotted lines are unvaccinated individuals. The different colors mean different age groups. So if you look at the difference, I think it's very clear that if you're not vaccinated, the cases of infection are much, much higher. If you want to compare one age group, let's just look at this yellow line, which is our adolescents. It's our 12 to 17-year-olds. This solid yellow line is the vaccinated group, and look at this big peak here of the unvaccinated. There's a tremendous difference in the number of cases between those who are vaccinated and those who are not. So that's very good evidence that the vaccine is effective. This chart on the right is similar, but it's just looking at hospitalizations. So you have this little almost flat line down here, went up a little bit with the Delta variant of the number of hospitalizations in those who are vaccinated compared to those who are unvaccinated. Look at that huge increase in peak in the unvaccinated individuals who are hospitalized during the Delta sort of surge. And then the data from September. So there's always a little bit of a lag at analyzing this data. So this data is up through September, but in the month of September, an unvaccinated person had 5.8 times the risk of testing positive for COVID and a 14 times risk of dying from COVID. So I think that's really important. I think we hear a lot about breakthrough cases, or if you get the vaccine, you could still get infected, which is true, but this graph shows you that you're much, much less likely to get infected if you're vaccinated. But if you think about the most important thing, which is staying alive and staying healthy and not ending up in a hospital or in an ICU or dying from this virus, they're tremendously effective. And then these are some of the numbers you might have heard. So I just kind of wanted to tell you where they came from in terms of like percentages. Like these are from the studies specifically of the Pfizer vaccine. So in adults, it was 95% effective. In adolescents, it was 100% effective. In children, it was 90.7% effective. And what that means is in those studies, that was the percentage of how effective it was in preventing any type of symptomatic COVID infection. So very effective in even preventing you from getting infected with COVID. But then if you think about what we just looked at this on the last graph in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, also incredibly effective. So what do we know about a little bit about the vaccine in our 5 to 11-year-olds, which is our newest vaccine. So the dose is 10 micrograms, which the number isn't important, but what is interesting to think about is it's 1/3 of the dose that everybody else gets. So for adolescents 12 and up and adults, the dose is the same, and it's 30 micrograms in each injection. So for our younger children, it's 10 micrograms. And that is based on science. That is based on studies that were done to compare responses in children of this age group to different doses. And what they found is that even with a dose that was 1/3 of what we had previously been using, the immune response as measured by antibodies in the blood was just as good as the 30 micrograms in these younger children. And it caused many less side effects. So this was the dose that was chosen to move forward with then in the rest of the clinical trials. And this is the dose that was authorized by the FDA. Just like in adults, it's a 2-dose series right now, 21 days apart. We now are recommending boosters for adults. We don't have any information on whether or not that's going to be needed in children. So for now, for our children, it's 2 doses, 21 days apart. It's an intramuscular injection in the arm, just like most of the other childhood vaccines. And one thing that's really nice and convenient, especially when you're at your pediatrician's office, is that the COVID vaccine can be given at the same time, before or after any of the other childhood vaccines that your child might be due for, which makes it very convenient. Let's see. So let's talk about side effects, right? So we know that the vaccine works, but what are the side effects? Because anytime you make a decision about a medicine, a procedure, a vaccine, anything about your health, you're thinking about, well, what are the risks and what are the benefits? So we've just talked about the benefits. Let's talk about the risks or the side effects. So this is another very busy slide, but I wanted to just, again, I think numbers can really show this for you. What is listed on this table are all the most common side effects. So maybe you've all experienced some of these. I in particular, I received the Pfizer vaccine. I had pain in my arm for a day and I had fatigue. Those were the only symptoms I had. But other more common symptoms are headache, chills, muscle pain, joint pain, and fever. And I just want to compare a couple of columns for you. So what I have here is adults, and this is dose 1 and dose 2, adolescents, dose 1 and dose 2. Most of the side effects are more severe or more common after the second dose. And then children, our 5 to 11-year-olds, dose 1 and dose 2. So let's look at our children. By far the most common side effect in the children in the study was pain in the arm, which is very expected. The next most common were fatigue and headache. And then chills, muscle and joint pain and fever were more towards the bottom. But look at the percentages. So most of the kids had pain in their arm, 71%. 39% had fatigue. That's compared to 66% of the adolescents and 59% of adults. 28% of the children had headache. That's compared to 65% of adolescents and 52% of adults. Only 7% of children had fever. That's compared to 20% of adolescents and 60% of adults. So what seems to be the case is that the kids are doing better. They are having sort of the profile of the side effects that they're experiencing is similar to what we're seeing in adolescents and adults, but they're less frequent, which is great. And we think that has to do with the fact that, as I just explained, the dose is 1/3 of the dose. So they're not sort of getting, although they're responding to it just as well, they're not, it's just not triggering as many of these side effects, which is great. Similar to what we see in adults and adolescents and what you may have experienced is most of the side effects that are shown here on this table are classified as mild to moderate, which means they're not severe and they go away in a day or two. And just like with us, if your child experienced any of these things, you can give them Tylenol or Motrin. One thing to think about with these, we call them side effects or adverse effects, but I actually like to explain them as their expected effects. They're actually signs that your body is seeing that vaccine and doing what we want it to do. This is a sign that your body is making those antibodies and doing what it needs to do to protect you in the future from becoming infected with COVID. I did want to mention myocarditis. I think this is a concern for a lot of people when it comes to vaccinating their children, and understandably so. So what is myocarditis? Myocarditis is inflammation of the heart muscle. It's a very rare side effect of the mRNA vaccine, so both the Moderna and the Pfizer. It is most common in adolescent or young adult males, so in about that 16 to 24-ish age group of males. It usually, in the vast majority of cases, resolves completely without treatment in a few days. And it's more common after the second dose compared to the first dose. And typically what we've seen is it occurs about 4 to 5 days after the second dose. The thing that's really important to know is that COVID-19 infection itself also causes myocarditis. And it's actually much more likely to get myocarditis from COVID-19 infection than it is from the vaccine. And I'm going to show you some numbers on that in a second. And it's actually much, much more severe, the myocarditis that happens after COVID-19 infection or after MIS-C that I mentioned earlier. That definitely affects the heart. Those are much more serious than what we've seen happen after the vaccine. So bottom line, big picture, if you think about it, the vaccine is actually still protecting you from myocarditis. And in terms of what we've seen in the numbers, I mentioned that it's most common in that male 16 to 20-ish age group. So if you took 100,000 males who were ages 16 to 29, 5 of them would develop myocarditis after the vaccine versus 59 after COVID-19 infection. So more than 10 times riskier to get this myocarditis after COVID-19 than from the vaccine. And then much, much less in females. 1 female in this age group could potentially develop myocarditis after the vaccine versus 39 after the COVID-19 infection itself. And there is reason to believe that the numbers and the risk for this would be even less in our 5 to 11-year-olds. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one is what we've already mentioned a couple of times already, is that the dose is only 1/3 of the dose. So most of the other side effects are much less common. And we have reason to believe that this would be less common as well. And the other thing is that now that we know more about the myocarditis that we're seeing after the vaccine, it is mirroring in terms of the epidemiology, in terms of who it impacts. It mirrors what we see in terms of myocarditis caused from other etiologies. So lots of viruses and infections can cause myocarditis, and other than COVID-19. And if you look at that form of myocarditis, it also is most common in this adolescent young adult male. So what we're seeing with the vaccine, it sort of mirrors what we know about myocarditis from other causes. And myocarditis from other causes is much, much, much less common in 5 to 11-year-olds. So although we cannot say for 100% with 100% certainty, we do have some scientific reason to make us think that it would be less common in this age group. There were no cases of myocarditis that were seen in the vaccine studies done in this age group, but they were too small. Based on what we know about the percentages, you wouldn't expect it. So we can't you really use that as evidence to say it's not going to happen. And certainly this will be studied closely moving forward. There's a lot of myths out there about COVID-19 vaccines. I've listed several of them here. Everything from microchips are implanted when you are getting the vaccine, which is really not possible. That it makes you magnetic, which is also not possible. That the development which was rushed, which is not true, as it was mentioned in the cartoon, the mRNA technology goes back decades. That it causes infertility. That piece of misinformation was based on basically one unfortunate statement that has led to a lot of misinformation, but it has continued to be studied, and there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that COVID-19 vaccines affect fertility, and there's really no reason to think that they should or would. If you've had COVID-19, you don't need a vaccine. That's not the case, and that's not the recommendation. We know that the immunity that you receive from the vaccine is much, we say robust, but stronger and long lasting than what you get from natural infection. So it's still recommended that you get the vaccine. The vaccine can change your DNA, not possible. It does not even enter the part of your cell where your DNA is located. And as was mentioned in the cartoon, the components of the vaccine are only in your body for a few hours. We already talked about the fact that the mRNA technology is not new, and that the last one, you can get COVID from the vaccine. Yeah, as was explained, that is not possible. As was explained in the cartoon, there's no parts of the virus that's actually in the vaccine. The vaccine is just giving your body the instructions that it needs to make that spike protein. So there's actually no part of the COVID-19 vaccine that's going into your body. So there's no way you could get the infection from the vaccine. These are just a few more sort of things about the myths. But let me see, I think I mentioned most of these. It does not interfere with puberty or fertility. The vaccines are not considered experimental. We talked about the fact that it cannot alter your DNA, and you don't shed anything. So yeah, that's another thing, that like you're going to be shedding the virus after you get the vaccine. But again, as we sort of similar to what we just talked about, there's no parts of the virus that are in the vaccine. So there's nothing for you to shed. That can happen from some of our live vaccines that we give for other childhood infectious diseases, but absolutely is not something that we're dealing with the COVID vaccine. So why is it important to get vaccinated? And I think first and foremost, to me, it's to stay healthy, for you to stay healthy, for your child to stay healthy, also to protect those around you. So we all can spread, anybody of any age can spread COVID-19 and infect any other person. So if you have people living in your home who are at increased risk of doing poorly if they become infected, such as the elderly or somebody with lots of underlying medical problems or immune system problems, the more protected everyone around them is, the more protected they will be. So the same is the case for your youngest children and babies. They are too young to get the COVID vaccine, but the more protected everybody around them is from COVID, the more protected that child will be. Another reason that I like to put on here, so you can keep doing all the things you like to do. And I think about this mostly in terms of education and activities that our children are missing out on. You know, the more the virus spreads, the more surges that we see, the more things have to be locked down or school reverts back to virtual. The more of us who are vaccinated, the less likely those things are to occur, and then to prevent a resurgence. So we are dealing with a new variant, right? Just over the last couple of days, the Omicron, and the variants have to do with the fact that the more the virus replicates, every time the virus replicates, which happens hundreds of thousands of times in every person who's infected, little mistakes can be made in how that virus is structured. And some of them will lead to these variants that can then be more dangerous in terms of spreading easier, or potentially cause more serious infection. So the more people that are vaccinated and the less this virus spreads, the less chance there is that more variants are going to come. And the more likely we'll eventually finally get to the end of this pandemic. I just wanted to show you some numbers just in terms of how we are doing with vaccinations in the United States. This kind of crazy looking map, all I want you to do is look at the colors. The brighter the green, the darker the green, the more people are vaccinated. The lighter the green, the less people are vaccinated. So you can see there's some regional variation, and for some reason, certain states don't report their numbers. So that's why Texas is gray. But look at Arkansas is kind of in the middle here. And there's not a lot of like bright dark green, and there are some areas of lighter green. We're going to look at that in a little more detail on the next slide. But just so you're aware, so far in the United States, we've had close to 200 million people fully vaccinated. And so this represents, of all ages, 59% of the population in the United States is fully vaccinated. If you look at the elderly, at those 65 and up, 86% are fully vaccinated. So that's pretty good for the elderly. Here's Arkansas. So you can sort of find where you live, find your county, and the darker the green, the more vaccinated people there are, the lighter the green, the less vaccinated people there are. In Arkansas, we have 49% of our population of all ages are fully vaccinated, 58% of our children ages 12 and up, and 77% of our elderly are vaccinated. So less than, the country as a whole, but we're definitely, I think we're making slow but steady, I hope, progress. So we've had close to 1.5 million people in Arkansas who are fully vaccinated, and another close to 325,000 who have had that first dose. This information, which came from the Arkansas Department of Health website, I think is very interesting, and it sort of puts it into perspective for me. If you look at the cases, hospitalizations, and deaths from COVID in Arkansas, 86% of the cases, 87.9% of the hospitalizations, and 86% of the deaths occurred in those who are not fully vaccinated. So I think that's very powerful evidence of how well the vaccines work. And I think that's a good way to think about it. As far as the numbers in children, so this was as of November 24th. There have been 3.6 million children ages 5 to 11 who have received their first dose. So that represents 13% of all children of that age group in the United States. And then in our adolescents, 15 million or 60% have received at least one dose, and 12.6 or 50% of the children ages 12 to 17 are fully vaccinated. So half the kids in the country are fully vaccinated. How are we doing in Arkansas? So that also varies by state, but we are right at that 50% mark in Arkansas. So of all the eligible children ages 12 to 17 years of age who are who live in Arkansas, 50% have been vaccinated. It's too soon. I don't have any numbers or data like this to show you for that younger age group. Probably in another few weeks, we'll have some of that data. But yeah, you can sort of see the regional variation, the darker blue in California, Vermont, New York. Vermont's up to 80%. And then you have West Virginia's 35%, Tennessee is only 40%. So we certainly could be doing better, but we're making progress. Now, as was mentioned, I do want to talk a little bit about the other childhood vaccines. I don't have data to show you, but one of the concerning things is that we saw a huge drop off in the number of kids getting their normal everyday childhood vaccines. This started right at the very beginning of the pandemic when sort of everything locked down, and to be honest, kids just weren't going in for their checkups and things like that. But the problem is we never really fell behind, or we never really caught back up. So there was, as of this summer, over 10 million doses of vaccines that had not been given, that should have been given, which is a lot. And that's really concerning because that leads to the potential for other vaccine preventable illnesses in our children to make a resurgence. So the last thing we need is to be dealing with COVID and then to be dealing with a measles outbreak. That would be awful. But the thing is, I think we've all learned a lot about vaccines through this pandemic, and you've probably heard about the concept of herd immunity, which is basically, the percentage of people in the population that need to be vaccinated for a specific infectious disease to keep it from coming back. And for measles, which is one of the most contagious viruses that we have, you need 95% of the community to be vaccinated to keep measles from coming back. And I don't know if you remember, it was in 2018 or 2019, there was actually measles outbreaks. Most were in New York, but there were thousands of cases of measles in the United States, and we actually almost lost our designation as a country where measles has been eradicated. So it certainly happens. It certainly does not take a lot for us to be more at risk for some of these infections that, to be honest, we don't really think about a whole lot, but it's important. So I would just kind of think about that for your own kids. And if they are a little bit behind, get them back into the pediatrician so that they can get caught up on their vaccines. And the one thing to really think about at this time of the year is influenza. And I have on this slide, flu season is coming. I think I should say that it's here. I actually just saw some reports that there have been some outbreaks on college campuses of influenza. So it is time. It is that time of year to get our flu shots. The symptoms for influenza are very similar to COVID-19. It's really going to be impossible to tell one from the other without testing. It's important to remember that children can get very sick from influenza. I'll show you some numbers on the next slide. We certainly don't want our children to have to be dealing with both infections at the same time. So it really is important to get our flu shots this year. So last year, interestingly enough, we hardly saw any influenza. And I think it was because we were all if you think about this time last year, we were locked down, right? Everybody was inside. Lots of kids weren't going to school. We were doing a much better job about wearing our masks. And that's not the case this year. So I really am concerned that we're going to see a lot more influenza this year, especially than compared to last year. Now, if you look at 2019, 2020, which was the year before, we actually had our highest hospitalization rate ever for children because of influenza. And we had 182 deaths in children from influenza that year. And most of these were healthy children. 57% were children with no underlying medical conditions, and 74% were unvaccinated. So I think we hear a lot about, oh, the flu shot doesn't work, you can still get infected. That's true. But similar to what we already talked about with COVID, that vaccine goes a long way to keep you from ending up in the hospital and to keep you from dying from that infection. So that's really important. I've heard a lot of people, scientists talking about influenza, and it's all speculation at this point, like what's going to happen with the flu season this year. We hardly saw any last year, but there is concern that we could see a lot of flu this year for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're not as good. People are still more relaxed, right? So we're out and about more. We're not wearing our masks as much as we were last year. So I just think that naturally it would spread more. And then because we had such a mild to no flu season last year, that could influence how severe the flu season is this year. I think the way it's explained is we sort of get a little bit of protection. Like if we had flu last year, it would protect us a little bit from the flu this year. And because we didn't have it last year, we're not going to have that same level of protection. So it definitely remains to be seen, but it's certainly something to think about. And I would absolutely encourage you to, all children ages 6 months and older are eligible for the flu vaccine. So I would certainly encourage you to do that for your children. If you have questions about it, certainly talk to your pediatrician about that. So what's next? I think do all that we can to help stop the spread, and that's get vaccinated. And then in the meantime, wear a mask, socially distance, and stay home when you're sick in order to protect yourselves and others. And that's all the slides that I have. But I definitely wanted to take questions if there were any. Let me see, there was some in the chat. Oh, no questions, but just some good comments. So what questions do you have? We still have some time. So if there's anything I can try to help answer for you, I'd be happy to do so. As far as, where to get the vaccine, you can go to the Department of Health. Pediatricians are really being heavily encouraged to have the vaccine in our offices so that, you can go to someone you trust, someone someone who can take the time to answer your questions. We have it in our office. I don't know for sure like how many pediatric offices are carrying it, but it would certainly be worth inquiring about. And then as far as, because I know many of you have much younger children, I don't know when we'll have the vaccine available for younger children. What I'm hearing is that by the spring, which is very vague. Those studies are being conducted now, and we'll probably know more, I don't know, in a few months. But what I'm hearing right now is sometime in the spring.
I had a question. I know when I just went to get a booster, the pharmacist was offering me to take the flu shot. And I purposely told her, no, thank you for the flu right now. I'll be back in about 2-3 weeks for that, just because I wanted to space them out to see what are my symptoms from getting the booster, just in case anything did arise. When it comes to our children, since she was offering that for me as an adult, when it comes to our children, would you recommend they get both at the same time or space it out?
Yeah. Or? I would recommend you get both at the same time. We don't have any data that suggests that your symptoms are like your side effects are worse. They're certainly similar, So that list that we went through for the COVID side effects, they're very similar to what we see when we get our flu shots. But it's recommended to get them both at the same time. If you think about it, for me, it's a timing issue, right? That's three more weeks you're at risk for getting infected with the flu or COVID if you're spacing them out. So there's really, I would recommend that you just go ahead and get them both at the same time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So hi. Because I was listening. I mean, it was very good information, and because I definitely needed to know all these things.
Good.
All those myths were pretty much were the reason why I probably didn't get the vaccine as soon as it came out. But now that I know a lot of information now, what do you say to other parents who kind of they don't really know all this information that was given to me tonight, but they still have a chance at, learning more about the information instead of just going off of word of mouth saying, hey, someone said that if you get the vaccine, you're going to get the COVID. And I want to be able to kind of like advocate for that vaccine because I want to get it. I want to get it really, really, really soon. But and of course I had my doubts too. I was very scared, but now that I know all this information, I'm really ready to get protected. Like you said, help protect others, make sure my kids are good because I mean, I'm happy that they came out with this vaccine.
I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah, where we get our information from is so important, and we've heard so much about Facebook University or whatever. All this misinformation that's going around in social media. So I think having a trusted source of information is really important. I think people sort of, I don't know, when you say CDC these days, I think it's gotten such a bad rap, but there's really a lot of good information and it's scientific. Like they're not going to put something on their website that's not true or that's not evidence-based. So that would be a good place to start. And then the website I mentioned, the healthychildren.org, has excellent information about children. And even just, about the vaccine in general, that could be applicable to anybody. So that's another website that I would recommend that you look at.
And Kendria,
I appreciate you, Ms. Hartford. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to let you all know as well that this presentation, since it's being recorded, everyone will be receiving, just like you guys received the invitation today, you guys will also be receiving this recording as well. So you can share it with your friends and family. So if they had any questions, like here, take this presentation, she's talking about it right here. It's a real doctor.
Yes.
It's not just some random opinion. It's an actual doctor giving us information about it.
Yep.
Dr. Hartford, I had a question as well. You had mentioned that the spacing between the shot is for the COVID vaccine is 21 days. Mm-hmm. Now, is there any flexibility with that if something was to happen, or what kind of flexibility do you have there?
Yeah, you can give it any time after that 21 days. So there's no time that's too late. You're really not supposed to give it early, though. I think technically if you read the fine print, there's a 2 or 3 day grace period where you could give it and not be it really not be counted as early, but I would give it at 21 days or any time after. So there's no time is too late to get that second dose or to get that booster.
Okay, great. Thank you. Because that was a lot of questions that we've heard before. Were people concerned that if they missed their time frame, that it was like starting all over? Oh, no, absolutely not. You never have to start over. And yeah, it's hard to get there exactly at 21 days. We all have so much going on. But anytime after the 21 days, the sooner the better, because then it's considered 2 weeks after that second dose that you sort of have the maximum benefit and that you're quote unquote fully immunized. Although with all these booster recommendations, that definition of what means to be fully immunized, that might change. But
your maximum benefit after that second dose is 2 weeks after. So of course, the sooner you can get it at 21 days or later, the better, but it's never too late and you don't have to start over.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And now boosters are recommended for all adults. And it's, if you got Pfizer or Moderna, it's 6 months or after your second dose. And if you got J&J, it's 2 months or after. And you can get any booster. So you can make what they call mix and match. So regardless of what your first vaccine was, you can get any of the other vaccines for your booster.
I had a question, but
Sure.
you just answered it. So
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's great.
I just wanted to make a comment that I have learned so much tonight. I'm just blown away by the amount of information I actually took in tonight from this. And you took away the biggest fear that I have for my children, because my daughter is 4 and she's my oldest. And so she's still just too young for it. But when I said, when they have that one for her come out, I want them to be protected. But that fear, what is it?
Myocarditis.
Carditis. That was a fear, because the news just reports it that, oh, your hearts are being inflamed. And for a parent, that's like, what? I don't want
Very
that happening to my child.
Yep.
And so you really did help to put that to ease for me. And I feel confident now in my decision for when it does come out for there.
That makes me so happy. Yeah,
Thank you
I think
so much.
it sounds very scary, but if you think about the numbers and the fact that like it's so much more mild, and the fact that like by not getting the vaccine, I think we think so hard about like doing something, right? So there's all these like things that you think about that could happen if you get the vaccine, but we often don't think about the opposite of what could happen if you don't get the vaccine and the risks that you're taking. Because although it's much easier to not do something than to do something, you're actually putting yourself at risk for a lot of things by not doing something. In this case, by not taking the vaccine. And you're actually increasing your risk for myocarditis by not taking the vaccine compared to taking the vaccine. But that information we don't hear that, right? You don't hear that in the news. All you hear is what you just said. It's affecting the heart. And it makes it hard to like really get down to like, what is the situation that we're dealing with?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Brittany there. I appreciated that information right there, because I know my youngest one, he is getting ready to get his vaccine. And that has been my biggest fear. I was dreading it for that reason right there. But after listening to the presentation, I feel probably 100% better.
Oh, that makes me so happy. So my youngest is 15. Well, he just turned 16. So as soon as they authorized the vaccine from down to age 12, because at the time he was 15, it was right when all this myocarditis stuff first came out. And it was a concern for me too. I think it's so normal. And of course you're going to be concerned. But I can tell you that when he got his vaccine, which was like 2 days after they authorized it, when he came home, I felt so relieved. Like, I think I didn't, and he's a healthy, typical teenage boy, like no health problems whatsoever. But I don't think I even realized how worried I was about him in terms of getting infected. So although it was on my mind, like the myocarditis, like the relief that I felt after knowing that he was going to be protected from COVID, it definitely outweighed my fears and concerns about the myocarditis. So I don't know if everyone experiences that, but I was personally surprised. I was like, oh, I guess I was worrying about this. So it definitely provides a sense of comfort knowing, for me and probably most parents, that your children are protected once they're able to go ahead and get that vaccine. I think it's natural for all parents to have concerns, absolutely. So just find somebody. I'm glad this talk was so helpful. And for those who still have questions, it's just important to find somebody who can talk to them so that they can work through the things that they're most concerned about.
Well, I know I've truly appreciated it, and like I said,
Yes, I
just
appreciate
thank you.
everything.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear that.
Does anyone else have any questions?
No, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, awesome. So like I mentioned, this presentation will definitely be emailed and text out to everybody, so you'll all have the link. And we will also be posting it on our Facebook as well, so you can check that out too. So that's real easy to just share from our Facebook page, the link to the video, so your friends and family can also get this wonderful information.
Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully I'll see you all again another time.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Hartford. We appreciate your sharing your knowledge.
You are so welcome. My pleasure.
So I will stop recording.